Welcome back, everyone. Tonight we're traveling to ancient Rome, but we're not going to talk about emperors or gladiators or dramatic battles. We're going to talk about what ordinary Romans actually did with their days. The boring, repetitive, mundane reality of daily life in one of history's most famous cities. Before we begin, if you enjoy this type of content, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you want to. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It is always interesting to see who joins us for these quiet journeys through history. Now settle in comfortably. Maybe adjust your pillow, pull your blanket up a bit higher. We're going to move slowly through a typical day in ancient Rome. Not the Rome of movies and spectacle, but the Rome of ordinary people doing ordinary things. Getting up, eating porridge, going to work, using public toilets, coming home, eating more porridge, going to sleep, day after day, year after year. This won't be exciting, but that is the point. Because for most Romans, most of the time, life wasn't exciting. It was just life. Predictable, repetitive, filled with the small necessities of survival. So let's ease into that world together and understand what it really meant to be an ordinary person in ancient Rome. Let's start with where most Romans lived, not in grand villas or palatial estates. Those were for the wealthy few. Most Romans lived in insulae, apartment buildings that packed hundreds of people into cramped, multi-story structures. Your apartment, if you were an ordinary Roman, would be small. Perhaps 1 or 2 rooms for an entire family. The lower floors were slightly better. More space, better construction, safer. But those cost more, so you probably lived higher up, where the building got shoddier and the stairs got more numerous. The room itself would be simple. Bare walls, perhaps plastered, but not decorated. A few pieces of furniture, a bed or sleeping platform, a table, some stools, a chest for storing possessions. No kitchen, because cooking in wooden buildings was dangerous and usually prohibited. No running water, because that was several floors down at a public fountain. No private toilet, because that was down at street level or in a building nearby. You'd wake with the dawn or shortly after, because there was no artificial light worth mentioning. Oil lamps provided minimal illumination at significant cost, so most people simply lived by natural light. When it was dark, you slept or sat in darkness. When light came, you woke. The waking wasn't gentle. Rome was loud. Even in the early morning, the city would be filling with noise. Carts rumbling. They were only allowed in the city during nighttime hours, so the pre-dawn was full of them. People shouting, animals making noise, shops opening. The constant background roar of a densely packed urban environment. You'd rise from your bed. If you were fortunate enough to have actual bedding rather than sleeping on the floor, you might have a mattress stuffed with straw or wool, perhaps a blanket. The quality depended entirely on your economic situation. Your first awareness would be of temperature. In summer, the upper floors would be stifling, heat rising through the building with no real ventilation. In winter, they'd be freezing, with no heating except perhaps a portable brazier, if you could afford fuel, which was expensive and dangerous in a wooden building. You'd put on your clothes, which you might have slept in anyway. An ordinary Roman would own very few garments, a tunic or two, perhaps a cloak. You'd wear these items constantly until they wore out, at which point you'd obtain new ones somehow. There was no daily changing of clothes, no closet full of options. Your stomach would be empty. Dinner last night was hours ago, and breakfast, such as it was, would come later. For now, you just had to be awake, functioning, starting another day that would be largely indistinguishable from yesterday and tomorrow. The apartment around you would also be waking, family members stirring, neighbours in adjacent apartments making noise through thin walls. Privacy was not really a concept in an insula. You lived in close awareness of everyone around you, hearing their conversations, their arguments, their activities. And so the day began. Not with any ceremony or significance, just with waking, being cold or hot, being hungry, being surrounded by noise. Another day in Rome, another day of getting by. Once awake, there wasn't much of a morning routine in the way we'd understand it. You were already dressed, or you'd put on your tunic. That was the extent of getting dressed for the day. Personal hygiene was minimal in the morning. You might splash some water on your face, if you had water in the room, which you probably didn't. More likely you'd wait until later in the day when you might visit the public baths. Morning washing was not a standard practice. Your hair required attention. For men, this typically meant nothing or perhaps running fingers through it. For women, hair needed to be pinned or tied back, and this might take a few moments. But elaborate hairstyles were for the wealthy with slaves to help. Ordinary people kept their hair simple and functional. Breakfast, if you had it at all, was extremely basic. Many Romans didn't eat a formal breakfast. They'd simply leave the house and perhaps buy something from a street vendor later in the morning when hungry. But if you did eat something at home, it would be simple. Leftover bread from yesterday, if you had any. Perhaps dipped in wine or water to soften it. Maybe some olives if you had them. Possibly a bit of cheese. Nothing was cooked. Nothing was elaborate. Just basic calories to start the day. The meal would be eaten standing or sitting on a stool. There was no dining table for most families. You'd eat quickly because there were things to do, places to be, work to attend to. Eating was functional, not leisurely. Children, if you had them, needed to be dealt with. Older children might leave to start their own day, working if they were old enough, playing in the streets if they weren't. Younger children might stay with you or with another family member. Childcare arrangements were informal and depended on family networks. Before leaving, you'd need to use the toilet. This meant leaving your apartment and going down all those stairs to reach either a public latrine or a pot that could be emptied later. Roman multi-story buildings didn't have toilets on every floor. You went where the facilities were, and that was at ground level or below. The stairs themselves were a daily challenge. Multiple flights, narrow, often in poor repair. In darkness, they were dangerous. People fell, people died, but you navigated them daily because there was no choice. Once at ground level, you'd emerge into the Roman street, and this is where your actual day began, because the work of surviving in Rome happened outside your apartment, not inside it. Your tiny rooms were just for sleeping. Life happened in the streets, in the shops, in the public spaces. The morning air would hit you. In summer, already warm and smelling of the city, which is to say, not pleasant. Human waste, animals, cooking, smoke, bodies. Rome was an olfactory experience that modern people would find overwhelming. In winter, cold and damp, the smell slightly less overwhelming but still present, and you join the flow of people. Thousands of Romans like you, starting their days, moving through the streets toward whatever work or activity would occupy them until evening. Not excited, not dreading it, just doing it because it was what you did every day, over and over. Let's talk about food, because food dominated so much of daily life, and was also, for most Romans, monumentally boring. The staple of the Roman diet for ordinary people was pulse. This was a porridge, or thick mush, made from grain, usually wheat or barley. Not bread, which required ovens and skills many didn't have. Not meat, which was expensive. Not vegetables in any great variety. Just pulse, day after day, meal after meal, year after year. Making pulse was simple, which was part of why it was so common. You took grain, whole grain, or cracked grain, or grain meal, depending on what you could afford and what was available. You added water. You cooked it over heat until it thickened into a porridge. The texture varied depending on how much water you used and how long you cooked it. It could be thin like a soup or thick like a paste. Either way, it was grain and water, cooked. The flavor was grain. Just grain. If you were fortunate, you might add something to make it less monotonous. A little salt if you had it. Some olive oil if you could afford it. Maybe some herbs if they were available. Occasionally, if you were having a relatively good time economically, you might add some vegetables or even a tiny bit of meat. But most of the time, for most people, pulse was just pulse. Plain grain porridge. You ate it because it filled your stomach and provided calories, not because it was enjoyable or interesting or varied. Because it was what you had. You'd eat this for breakfast if you ate breakfast. You'd eat it for lunch, what Romans called prandium, which was usually a light midday meal. You'd eat it for dinner, cena, the main meal of the day. 3 times a day, the same basic thing. Pulse. Sometimes the grain would be different. Wheat was preferable, but more expensive. Barley was cheaper, but considered inferior. Millet was even cheaper and even less desirable. But whatever grain you had, you made pulse from it. The monotony of this diet is hard to overstate. Modern people eat an incredible variety of foods, different cuisines, different flavors, different textures. Ordinary Romans ate pulse. Variation was minimal. Excitement about food was not a part of daily life. This wasn't because Romans didn't know about other foods, they did. The wealthy ate quite well. Meats, fish, fruits, vegetables, complex dishes with sauces and seasonings. But that was for people with money and slaves to do the cooking. For ordinary people, elaborate meals were rare special occasions at best. The pulse would be eaten from a simple bowl or directly from the pot it was cooked in. You'd use your fingers or perhaps a wooden spoon. Utensils were minimal. Pottery was simple and functional, nothing fancy. And you'd eat it standing or sitting on a stool or on the floor. There was no dining room, no table set with plates and cups. You had a pot of pulse, you ate some, you were done. Children would eat the same thing. Infants would be weaned onto poles once old enough for solid food. Growing children would eat poles. Adults would eat poles. Old people would eat poles. From childhood to death, poles was the constant. The preparation took time but not much attention. You'd put it on to cook, do other things, come back to check it, eat when it was ready. In buildings where cooking inside was prohibited, you might use a communal kitchen area or a public cookshop. But the principle was the same. Make poles, eat poles, repeat. This was Roman food for ordinary people, not glamorous, not interesting, not varied, just sustaining. Calories that kept you alive to work another day, so you could earn enough to buy more grain, so you could make more poles, so you could eat again. The cycle was basic and unending. For many ordinary Romans, work meant working in or running a small shop. Rome was a city of shops, thousands of them lining the streets, occupying the ground floors of insulae, filling every available commercial space. These shops, called tabernae, were small, perhaps 10 feet wide, maybe 15 feet deep. That was your entire workspace. The front would typically be open to the street during business hours, closed with wooden shutters at night. If you were a shopkeeper, you might sell a specific type of good. Perhaps you sold grain, perhaps you sold olive oil, perhaps you sold pottery or lamps or clothing or any of the thousands of items people needed. Specialization was common, so your shop would focus on a particular product or small range of products. Your day would involve standing or sitting in your shop, waiting for customers. There was no advertising in the modern sense. People knew where shops were through experience and word of mouth. If they needed what you sold, they'd come to your street, your shop. When a customer arrived, you'd negotiate. Prices weren't fixed in the way they are now. Everything was negotiable. The customer would want to pay less. You'd want them to pay more. You'd both engage in the ancient ritual of bargaining until you reached an amount you both could accept. This took time. Every transaction required conversation, negotiation, agreement. Small transactions for small amounts, repeated dozens of times per day. Very rarely was any single sale large or significant. You survived on volume, many small sales adding up to enough to live on. The work was tedious. Stand in your shop. Wait. Customer arrives. Greet them. Show them goods. Negotiate price. Complete sale. Clean up. Wait for next customer. Repeat. All day, every day the shop was open, which was most days. If you were a craftsman, your shop would also be your workshop. Perhaps you made pottery. Perhaps you worked leather. Perhaps you repaired things. The front of your shop would be for selling, the back for making. You'd alternate between creating goods and selling them. This work was repetitive too. If you made pottery, you'd make the same types of pots over and over. Bowls, jars, cups, the same forms repeated endlessly. You'd get very good at making these specific items, but you'd make them thousands of times throughout your working life. The skill required was real. Being a craftsman meant years of learning and practice. But once learned, it became routine. Your hands knew what to do. Your mind could wander while your body performed familiar motions. Make pot, fire pot, sell pot, repeat. If you worked for someone else rather than owning your shop, the experience was similar but without the independence. You'd do what the shop owner told you to do. You'd get paid a wage, probably minimal. You'd have even less control over your time and work. The hours were long. Shops typically opened at dawn and remained open until dusk or until business died down. That is 12 hours or more in summer, less in winter, but always most of the daylight hours. 6 days a week, sometimes 7. There were some holidays and festival days, but these were irregular. You'd eat your midday meal in your shop or nearby, probably pulse brought from home or purchased from a street vendor. You'd eat quickly while continuing to mind the shop because leaving it unattended invited theft. The environment was not comfortable. In summer, the shop would be hot, sun beating in through the open front. In winter, it would be cold, no real heating possible. You'd dress for the weather and endure it. The social aspect was perhaps the most interesting part. Your shop was also your connection to the neighborhood. You'd see the same people regularly. You'd hear gossip, news, street arguments. You were embedded in the community whether you wanted to be or not. But the work itself was not exciting. It was standing, sitting, waiting, selling, making, selling again, over and over. The same location, the same products, the same basic interactions. You were working to earn money to buy food and pay rent. The work was means, not end. And at day's end, when darkness made continuing impossible or business had completely died down, you'd close your shutters, secure your goods and leave. To go home, eat dinner, more pulse, and sleep, so you could get up tomorrow and do it all again. We need to talk about toilets because this was a daily necessity that structured everyone's routine, and the Roman approach was very different from what modern people expect. For most Romans, using the toilet meant visiting a public latrine. These were scattered throughout the city in various states of maintenance and cleanliness. Some were better than others, but none were what we'd consider pleasant. The typical public latrine was a room with stone or wooden benches running along the walls. These benches had holes cut in them at regular intervals. You'd sit on a hole, do your business, and that was it. No privacy partitions, no doors, no isolation, just a row of holes where people sat side by side. The waste would fall into a channel below, where running water, if the latrine had it, and not all did, would carry it away to the sewers. The better latrines had this water flow. The worse ones simply had pits that needed to be emptied periodically by someone with that unfortunate job. Using such a facility required abandoning all modern notions of privacy. You'd walk in, find an available spot, sit down next to whoever else was there, do what you needed to do. Conversation was normal. Business was conducted. It was a social space as much as a functional one. For wiping, there was a sponge on a stick, a tersorium, shared among users. This would be rinsed in the water channel between uses. Yes, shared. Yes, the same one everyone else used. This was simply how it was done. The smell would be overwhelming to modern sensibilities. These were rooms where dozens of people daily evacuated their bowels. Even with water flow, even with the waste being carried away, the smell lingered and accumulated. You'd simply have to breathe through it. The timing of your visit would depend on your routine and needs. Many people would go in the morning before work. Others would go during the day when necessary. The latrines were public and accessible during daylight hours. At night, they'd be less appealing and potentially dangerous, so most people avoided them after dark. If you couldn't or wouldn't use the public latrine, alternatives existed, but were not ideal. Some buildings had private latrines, but these were for the wealthy. Some people used pots in their rooms, which then needed to be emptied somewhere, often just tossed out a window into the street below. This was common enough that laws addressed it, though enforcement was another matter. The public latrine was a necessary destination, but not a pleasant one. You'd go because you had to. You'd sit because sitting was the design. You'd endure the smell, the lack of privacy, the shared facilities, because that is what was available. For women, this was particularly problematic. Sitting exposed among strangers posed risks and discomforts that men didn't face to the same degree. Some women would wait until they could use less crowded facilities or find more private alternatives. Children would be taken to the latrine by parents or older siblings until old enough to go alone. This was just part of normal life. From childhood, you learned that using the toilet meant public exposure and shared facilities. The maintenance of latrines varied enormously. Some were relatively clean and well maintained, with regular water flow and periodic cleaning. Others were disgusting, barely functional, avoided except in desperation. You'd learn which was which in your neighborhood and adjust accordingly. Disease was a constant risk. All those people, all that waste, shared wiping implements, modern medicine would be horrified. But Romans didn't understand germ theory. They cleaned when things got too foul, but they didn't grasp the invisible health risks. Intestinal diseases were common, and facilities like this certainly contributed. The experience was simply part of being Roman. Multiple times per day, you'd need to evacuate your bowels or bladder, and that meant leaving your home or workplace, walking to a latrine, sitting among strangers, and using shared facilities, then returning to whatever you were doing. No privacy, no comfort, no pleasant, smelling, well-lit private bathroom. Just a public room with holes and other people and smells and shared sponges, every single day, for your entire life. This was Roman toilet reality, unglamorous, uncomfortable, unavoidable. If there is one thing Romans are famous for, it is their baths. The public bathing establishments were indeed impressive, large, elaborate, featuring hot rooms and cold rooms and various amenities. But let's talk about what the experience was actually like for an ordinary person. First, you'd need to pay to enter. The cost was usually small, a quadrans or so, making baths accessible to most free Romans. But small is relative. If you were barely making ends meet, even a quadrans mattered. So some people bathed frequently, others less so, depending on their finances. You'd typically visit the baths in the afternoon. This was the standard time for bathing, after work but before dinner. The baths would be crowded, because everyone else had the same idea. Hundreds of people all trying to bathe simultaneously. Upon entering, you'd go to the changing room, the apoditerium. This was a room with niches or shelves where you'd leave your clothes. You'd undress completely. Romans bathed nude, and put your clothes and any possessions in a niche. Security was a concern. Theft from the changing rooms was common. If you had anything valuable, you'd need to watch it or arrange for someone to guard it. Many people simply didn't bring valuables to the baths for this reason. Once undressed, you'd proceed through the bathing sequence. This typically started with the tepidarium, a warm room that served as a transition. You'd sit or stand here, beginning to sweat, adjusting to the temperature, then to the caldarium, the hot room. This would be quite hot, heated by the hypercaust system, hollow floors and walls through which hot air from furnaces circulated. You'd sit in this heat, sweating profusely. The room would be full of naked people, all sweating together. Bathing itself involved scraping your skin with a strigil, a curved metal tool. You, or a slave or a friend, would scrape your skin to remove the sweat, oil, and dirt. This was how Romans cleaned themselves. No soap, just oil applied to the skin and then scraped off. The hot room would be loud. Conversation echoed off stone walls. People talked, conducted business, gossiped. Some might exercise first, then bathe. Others might just sit and sweat. The atmosphere was social and busy. After sufficient time in the heat, you'd move to the frigidarium, the cold room. This usually included a cold plunge pool. You'd immerse yourself in cold water, a shocking contrast to the heat you'd just left. This was considered healthy and invigorating. The pools would be crowded, many bodies in limited space. The water was changed periodically but not frequently. By afternoon, the water you were bathing in had been used by hundreds of others. Again, germ theory wasn't understood, so this didn't concern Romans the way it would concern us. Throughout this process, you'd be surrounded by bodies. Naked Romans of all ages, all body types, all social classes to some extent, though the very wealthy had private baths and wouldn't mix with commoners. But among the common people, the baths were a great equalizer. Everyone was naked. Everyone was using the same facilities. For women, baths were available, but at different times than men, to maintain some separation. Women would have their designated hours, men would have theirs. The experience was similar, undressing, bathing, socializing, but segregated by gender. Some baths offered additional amenities. There might be areas for exercise, libraries for reading, gardens for walking, food and drink vendors. The larger bath complexes were like community centers. But even with these extras, the core experience was the bathing itself. The whole process could take an hour or more. You'd arrive, undress, move through the warm and hot rooms, scrape yourself, plunge in cold water, perhaps socialize, eventually dress and leave. It was a significant time investment, but it was also your primary means of getting clean. For an ordinary Roman, this happened perhaps once or twice a week, more or less depending on personal preference and financial situation. You'd walk to the baths, pay your fee, go through the routine, and return home cleaner than you arrived. The baths were one of the more pleasant aspects of Roman daily life. They provided warmth in winter, cleanliness year-round, and social connection. But they were also crowded, noisy, lacking in privacy, and required time and money. They weren't luxury. They were necessity, made slightly more bearable by the social aspect and the Roman engineering that made large public baths possible. Much of Roman life happened in the streets. The narrow lanes between buildings, the forums and squares, the various public spaces. This is where Romans lived much of their daily lives. The streets were crowded. Rome at its height had perhaps 1 million people packed into a limited urban area. That meant dense crowds, constant jostling, little personal space. You'd navigate through masses of people constantly. The noise was overwhelming. Shopkeepers calling out their wares. Cartwheels on stone pavement. Craftsmen hammering, sawing, working, people talking, arguing, negotiating. Street vendors hawking food, beggars asking for coins. The combined sound would be a constant roar. The smells were equally intense. Food cooking, bread, fish, meat for those who could afford it. Human waste, from chamber pots emptied into streets, from public latrines with inadequate drainage, from animals used for transport, wood smoke from cooking fires, unwashed bodies in close proximity. All of these combined into what we'd call a stench, but what Romans simply considered the smell of the city. The streets themselves were paved with stone in the city centre, but might be dirt or poorly maintained in other areas. They'd be covered with various substances, mud when it rained, dust when it was dry, always some amount of refuse and waste. You'd walk carefully to avoid the worst of it. Carts were prohibited during daylight hours in much of the city to reduce congestion, but this meant they rumbled through at night, making sleep difficult. And during the day, people transported goods on their backs, or with hand carts, or with animals. Donkeys, mules, sometimes cattle moving through the streets. Street vendors were everywhere, selling food, primarily. You could buy bread, vegetables, prepared foods, wine, water. These vendors operated from small stalls or simply stood with their goods. You'd buy from them if you needed something immediately and didn't want to go to a permanent shop. The food from street vendors was cheap but of questionable quality. This was sustenance for people without resources to cook or buy better. You'd eat it standing up, right there in the street. Maybe it was a piece of bread, maybe some dubious meat. You'd eat it, it would fill your stomach, and you'd move on. Beggars were common. People who couldn't work, who had no family support, who survived on charity. They'd sit in busy areas calling out to passers-by, asking for help. Some were disabled, some were elderly, some were simply destitute. You'd see them daily, perhaps give a coin occasionally if you could afford it, more often just walk past. Crime was a constant concern. Pickpockets worked the crowded streets. Bags could be snatched. Going out at night was dangerous. Even during the day, you'd be aware of threats. You'd keep your belongings close, stay aware of your surroundings, avoid certain areas known to be dangerous. The streets were also entertainment. Without television or internet or even books for most people, watching street life was how you passed time. You'd see arguments, you'd see couples, you'd see children playing, you'd see businessmen conducting deals, you'd see everything human happening right there in public. Street performers might appear. Musicians, acrobats, storytellers, they'd perform for coins tossed by watchers. The quality varied wildly, but it was something different to see and hear. Public announcements happened in the streets. News was spread by word of mouth, by official announcements read in forums, by notices posted in public places. You'd hear about new laws, about games, about executions, about whatever the authorities wanted people to know. Religious processions would move through the streets during festivals. Priests, musicians, worshippers, sometimes animals being led to sacrifice. These disrupted normal flow, but were also spectacles to observe. The streets were where you'd meet people, not by appointment in homes, but by happening across them during the day. You'd stop, talk, exchange news, perhaps conduct some business, then continue on your way. Social networks were maintained through these casual encounters. For children, the streets were playground. They'd play games, chase each other, get into trouble. Parental supervision was minimal. Children were expected to navigate the urban environment from a young age. All of this, the crowds, the noise, the smells, the activity, the danger, the entertainment, this was daily street life. You'd spend hours each day moving through these spaces, going from home to work to baths to home again. The streets were the connective tissue of your life, the space between destinations and also destinations themselves. Let's address a major misconception. When people think of Roman entertainment, they think of gladiatorial games. And yes, these happened, but they were occasional, not daily or even weekly. They were special events, often sponsored by wealthy individuals or the state for particular occasions. An ordinary Roman might see gladiatorial games a few times in their entire life, perhaps once a year if they were lucky, and lived in a city where games were held regularly, perhaps less often if they lived in smaller towns. These were not daily entertainment. So what did Romans actually do for entertainment on a regular basis? Mostly they talked. Conversation was the primary entertainment. You'd talk with neighbours, with co-workers, with people you encountered at the baths or in the streets. You'd discuss news, gossip, politics, business, whatever was happening. This cost nothing and filled hours. Dice games were popular. Romans loved gambling despite periodic official disapproval. Men would gather to play dice, betting small amounts. The games were simple: roll dice, highest number wins, variations on that theme. You'd lose a few coins, win a few coins, pastime. Board games existed. A game called Trunculi, similar to chess or checkers, involved moving pieces on a board. If you had access to a board and pieces, you might play. This was more common among those with some leisure time and resources. Public spaces offered free entertainment, watching people in forums or squares. Observing trials, legal proceedings were public and could be quite dramatic. Listening to speeches by politicians or philosophers who spoke in public spaces. Religious festivals provided breaks in routine. These happened throughout the year, different gods honoured on different days. Some festivals included public feasts, free food distribution, games, performances. These were actual entertainment. Not daily, but regular enough to provide occasional variety. Theatre existed, but it wasn't what modern people picture. Roman theatre was often crude, with broad humour and pantomime. It was entertainment for the masses, slapstick, bawdy jokes, physical comedy. Tickets cost money, though usually not much. You'd attend occasionally if you could afford it. Chariot races were more common than gladiatorial games, though still not daily. The Circus Maximus in Rome could hold huge crowds for race days. Fans supported different teams, blues, greens, reds, with real passion. If races were happening and you could get in, this was exciting entertainment. But chariot races, like gladiatorial games, were scheduled events, not daily occurrences. Most days involved no special entertainment at all. So what did you actually do with free time? You sat, you walked, you watched the street, you talked with people you knew, you perhaps visited a tavern if you had money for wine. You went to the baths not just for washing but for socializing. You maybe listened to someone telling stories or sharing news. For children, entertainment was playing in streets and alleys, making up games with whatever was available, running, chasing, pretending. The same universal childhood activities that happen in any era, just in a Roman urban setting. For adults, entertainment was often drinking. Wine was cheap and widely available. A cup or two of wine in the evening, talking with friends or neighbours, was a common way to pass time. This wasn't elaborate, just sitting with wine, talking, eventually going home to sleep. Reading was entertainment for those who could read, which wasn't everyone. Books were expensive, hand-copied, not widely available. Public libraries existed in some places, but access wasn't universal. Reading was a privilege more than a common entertainment. Exercise was done by some, wrestling, running, swimming, if pools were available. This was considered healthy and beneficial. But it was active rather than entertaining in the spectator sense. Religious observance provided structure and occasional interest. Going to temple, participating in rituals, making offerings. This was duty more than entertainment, but it broke up the routine and provided meaning. The key point is that ordinary Romans didn't have constant entertainment. There was no television, no radio, no internet, no constant stream of content. There were occasional special events, but mostly there was just daily life, with conversation and simple activities filling the time between work and sleep, and that was fine because they knew nothing else. Entertainment wasn't something you expected constantly. It was occasional, special, appreciated when it happened. The rest of the time, you just lived, and living itself was enough to occupy you. Roman family life was lived in very small spaces for most people. That tiny apartment we discussed earlier, that was where an entire family existed. Parents, children, sometimes extended family members, all sharing a room or two. Privacy didn't exist in any meaningful sense. You'd sleep in the same room as your spouse and children. You'd eat together because there was nowhere else to eat. You'd conduct all aspects of family life in full view of each other because there was no alternative. Children would be present for everything. Adult conversations, arguments, intimate moments. The concept of keeping things from children because of their age didn't really apply when everyone lived in a single room. Children learned about life by witnessing it constantly. Sleeping arrangements were practical. Parents might have an actual bed. Children might sleep on pallets on the floor or share sleeping space. Infants would sleep with their mothers. Older children would find space wherever available. Comfort was secondary to managing the available space. Discipline was probably swift and physical. In a small space with multiple children, maintaining order would be challenging. Parents would use whatever methods they considered effective. Roman culture accepted physical punishment of children as normal and necessary. Family meals, as we've discussed, were usually pulse or similarly simple food. The family would eat together not out of tradition or bonding but out of practicality. Everyone needed to eat, and there was only one pot of food. Mealtimes were functional rather than social occasions. Women's work within the family involved whatever could be done in the small space. Perhaps spinning wool into thread if they had wool and a spindle. This was work that could be done while managing children and the household. The thread could be sold for small amounts of money or used for the family's needs. Men's work happened outside the home, as we've discussed, but men were home in the evenings, and then the entire family would be cramped together, managing somehow in limited space. Marriages were economic arrangements more than romantic partnerships, especially among the lower classes. You married someone suitable, someone who could contribute to the family's survival. Love might develop, or it might not. Either way, you lived together and raised children together, because that is what was expected and necessary. Children came frequently. Birth control was limited and unreliable. Most women would bear multiple children throughout their fertile years. Many of these children wouldn't survive to adulthood. Infant and child mortality was high, but families would still be relatively large most of the time. Multiple children in a tiny apartment meant constant noise and motion. Children playing, fighting, crying. Parents trying to manage them while also managing their own needs. The stress would be significant but simply accepted as normal. Extended family provided support networks. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. These relationships were important for mutual aid. If you were struggling, family might help. If family was struggling, you'd help them. This wasn't altruism, it was survival insurance. Family ties meant you had support beyond just your immediate household. But these extended family relationships also meant obligations. You couldn't ignore family needs. If a relative asked for help, you'd be expected to provide it if able. This could be a burden, especially when you had little to spare. Death was a regular presence in family life. High mortality rates meant most families experienced deaths frequently. Children died. Adults died young from disease, accidents, childbirth. You'd experience grief regularly and learn to continue functioning despite it. Religion within the family involved household shrines. Most families maintained a small shrine to household gods, the lares and penates. Daily offerings would be made, small amounts of food, wine, incense. This was the father's responsibility primarily, but all family members would participate. These religious observances were brief and practical, not elaborate ceremonies, just simple daily acknowledgements of the household gods who were believed to protect the family. You'd make your offering, say your prayers, continue with your day. Festivals would be celebrated as family units. On appropriate days you might eat something special if you could afford it, perhaps visit temples together, participate in public celebrations. These broke the routine and provided something to look forward to. But mostly, family life was about managing in small spaces, everyone going about their individual activities while remaining in close proximity, tolerating each other because there was no escape, supporting each other because you were all in the same situation, making do with what you had because that was your only option. Let's talk about information and knowledge of the world, because for an ordinary Roman in the city, news from beyond Rome came slowly if at all, and your awareness of the broader empire was limited. You might know, in a general sense, that Rome controlled vast territories. You'd hear about provinces, Gaul, Hispania, Africa, Syria, others, but specific knowledge of these places would be vague and second-hand. News travelled at the speed of people walking or riding. If something happened in a province, it might be weeks or months before word reached Rome, and when it did reach Rome, it would go first to officials and the elite. Information would filter down to ordinary people slowly and incompletely. You'd hear things in the streets. Someone would share news they'd heard from someone else. A trader would mention conditions in another city. A soldier returning from service would talk about his experiences. But all of this would be informal, unverified, mixed with rumor and exaggeration. Political news, who the emperor was, major appointments, significant laws. This you'd probably know because it was announced publicly and affected you directly. If the emperor changed, you'd learn about it because there would be ceremonies and announcements. But news of battles, rebellions, disasters in distant provinces, you might hear something eventually, or you might not. It didn't affect your daily life directly, so whether you knew about it wasn't crucial. Maps were not widely available. Most Romans would never see a map of the empire. Your geographic knowledge would be limited to places you'd been or places people talked about. The shape of the Mediterranean world, the layout of provinces, the locations of major cities, all of this would be vague or unknown to you. You'd know Rome itself fairly well. Your neighborhood intimately, other parts of the city less well. But beyond Rome, your knowledge became very hazy very quickly. If you never traveled, which many Romans didn't, your entire world was Rome. The city defined your reality. News of elsewhere was abstract, almost fictional. Those places existed, but they weren't real to you in the way Rome was real. Reading news was possible for the literate, which was a minority. Acta diurna, daily acts, were posted publicly. These were official notices about government business, laws, public works, events. If you could read and took time to go where these were posted, you could learn some news. But this was current Rome news, not distant province news. Rumors spread constantly. Without reliable news sources, rumors filled the void. Someone would claim to know something, others would repeat it, and false information would circulate as freely as truth. Distinguishing between them was difficult. For major events, wars that required recruitment, famines that affected food supply, plagues that spread to Rome, you'd eventually know because the effects would reach you. But the details would be unclear. You'd know something was happening without understanding exactly what or why. This isolation wasn't unusual or considered a problem. It is simply how life was. The world was big, communication was slow, and most people's lives were local. What happened in Rome mattered, what happened far away was remote and abstract. Your identity as Roman came from living in Rome, following Roman customs, being subject to Roman authority. You didn't need detailed knowledge of the empire to be Roman. You just needed to be here, living your life, following the rules. If you met someone from a province, they'd seem foreign even though technically they were also Roman. Different accents, different customs, different perspectives. The empire was diverse, but most Romans experienced only their own local corner of it. Letters could bring news, but only if you had reason to correspond with people elsewhere and could read and write. This was uncommon among ordinary people. Most had no long-distance connections that would generate correspondence, so you lived in a kind of information bubble. Rome was your world. What happened here mattered. What happened elsewhere was distant rumor, possibly true, possibly false, ultimately not something you could verify or really understand. Your concerns were local. Was food affordable? Were there jobs? Was the neighborhood safe? These immediate questions dominated your attention. News from Gaul or Syria was irrelevant to these pressing daily concerns, and so your life proceeded in relative ignorance of the wider world. You were part of a vast empire, but you experienced only a tiny part of it. The rest existed somewhere out there beyond your knowledge and your concern. Religion permeated Roman life, but for ordinary people, it was more about routine observance than deep spirituality. Let's talk about what religious life actually looked like day to day. The gods were everywhere in Roman thought. Every aspect of life had associated deities, but you didn't think about theology or have personal relationships with gods in the way modern religions encourage. You performed the rituals, made the offerings, and hoped the gods would be favorable. Each household had its shrine to household gods, the lares and penates. These were small spirits believed to protect the home and family. Your daily religious obligation was simple. Make a small offering at this shrine, perhaps a bit of food, perhaps some wine, perhaps just incense. This took a few moments in the morning or evening. The offering wasn't about feeling anything or believing anything particular. It was about maintaining proper relationships with the divine forces that affected your life. You did it because it was done, because not doing it might bring bad luck. Public temples were scattered throughout Rome. These were dedicated to various gods: Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Venus, countless others. You might visit a temple occasionally to make an offering for a specific reason. Perhaps you were starting a new business venture and wanted divine favor. Perhaps someone was ill and you were asking for healing. Visiting a temple involved going there, perhaps waiting if others were also there, approaching the altar, making your offering, saying a brief prayer or request, leaving. This wasn't a weekly worship service like modern religious gatherings. It was a specific transaction with a specific purpose. Priests maintained the temples and performed the official rituals, but being a priest was more like a civic duty than a spiritual calling. Priests were responsible for performing rituals correctly, maintaining temple property, overseeing sacrifices. It was a job more than a vocation. Sacrifices, killing animals as offerings to gods, happened regularly at temples, but as an ordinary Roman, you wouldn't typically perform these yourself. You'd pay for an animal if you wanted a significant offering, and priests would handle the actual sacrifice. You might participate as a witness, and afterwards, the meat would be distributed. So sacrifices were both religious acts and sources of meat for public consumption. Festivals dedicated to various gods occurred throughout the year. These were public holidays when you wouldn't work. You might attend public ceremonies, watch processions, receive distributed food if the festival included public feasts. These were welcome breaks in routine, but even festivals were more social and practical than deeply spiritual. Yes, they honored gods, but they were also just days off work, chances to eat better food, opportunities for entertainment. The religious aspect was present, but mixed with secular enjoyment. Omens and divination were taken seriously. If a significant decision needed to be made, you might consult someone who read omens, observed birds, examined animal entrails, interpreted dreams. This was accepted as a way to learn the god's will, but for ordinary daily decisions, you just decided and hoped for the best. Consulting omens was for major questions, not whether to buy bread today or tomorrow. Magic and superstition existed alongside official religion. Amulets to ward off evil, curses inscribed on lead tablets to harm enemies. love potions, fertility charms. Many Romans used these, believing they worked independently of or alongside official religious practices. The line between religion and superstition was blurry. Both involved supernatural forces affecting the world. You'd participate in official rituals and also carry an amulet for luck. Both made sense in the Roman worldview. Emperor worship was part of official religion, especially in later periods. The emperor was divine or semi-divine. You'd participate in ceremonies honoring the emperor, not out of genuine worship necessarily, but because it was expected and politically wise. Refusing religious observance could be dangerous. Christians and others who refused to honor Roman gods faced persecution, not primarily for their beliefs but for disrupting the social order. Religion was civic duty, and refusing it suggested disloyalty to Rome. For most Romans, religious life was habitual. You did what was expected, what your parents did, what everyone around you did. You made your household offerings, participated in festivals, visited temples when you had specific needs, acknowledged omens and divine will, but it wasn't about inner transformation or personal relationship with deity. It was about maintaining proper relationships with the divine world through correct rituals. Do the rituals, the gods remain favorable. Neglect the rituals, risk divine displeasure. This made religion easier in some ways. No weekly services to attend, no sacred texts to study, no complex theology to understand. Just perform the expected rituals when expected, and you'd fulfilled your religious obligations. And so religion was woven through daily life without dominating it. Brief morning offerings, occasional temple visits, participation in public festivals. Religious duties were real but not time-consuming. They added structure to life without requiring intensive focus or commitment. Romans got sick frequently, and the medical care available was primitive by modern standards. Let's discuss what happened when you became ill. For minor ailments, you simply endure them. A cold, a cough, a stomachache. These were part of life. You keep working if you could. You rest if you could. No one expected illness to be treated unless it was serious. Home remedies were the first recourse, various herbs, foods, or practices believed to help with different conditions. These remedies were passed down through families and communities. Some probably had mild beneficial effects. Many did nothing. Some might have made things worse. If illness persisted or worsened, you might seek outside help. This could mean several things. You might visit a temple and make offerings to Asclepius, god of medicine, asking for healing. This cost little beyond the offering and might provide psychological comfort. Whether it helped physically is doubtful, but belief in divine intervention was real. You might consult a physician if you could afford it, which many couldn't. Roman medicine was a mix of observation, theory, and pure guesswork. Some physicians had genuine knowledge, especially about injuries and visible conditions. Much of medical theory was completely wrong by modern standards. A physician might prescribe herbal remedies, dietary changes, bloodletting, purging, or various other treatments. Some of these might help, many did nothing. Some were actively harmful, but they were the best available. Surgery existed for certain conditions, removing growths, setting broken bones, treating wounds. Without anesthesia, surgery was agonizing. Without antibiotics, infection was common. Surgery was a desperate measure, only attempted when absolutely necessary. Dental problems were common and largely untreatable. Toothaches had to be endured. Teeth that became too problematic might be pulled, but this was crude and painful. Most people simply lived with dental pain. Chronic conditions meant chronic suffering. If you developed arthritis, you'd be in pain for the rest of your life. If you had persistent digestive problems, you'd be uncomfortable constantly. No effective treatments existed for most chronic illnesses. Epidemics swept through Rome periodically. Diseases we can now prevent or treat would kill thousands. When epidemic hit, all you could do was hope you survive. Rich and poor alike died, though crowded living conditions made the poor more vulnerable. Injuries from work or accidents were common. A bad cut might heal, or it might become infected and kill you. A broken bone might set properly, or might heal crooked, leaving you permanently impaired. Workplace safety didn't exist as a concept. Childbirth was dangerous for women. Many died in childbirth or from complications afterwards. This was accepted as the risk of being female. Women bore multiple children knowing that any pregnancy might be their last. If you became seriously ill and could work, you faced economic disaster. No sick leave, no disability payments, no safety net. If you couldn't work, you could earn money. If you could earn money, you could buy food or pay rent. Family might help, but they had their own struggles. Mental illness wasn't understood. Someone behaving strangely might be thought possessed by demons, cursed by gods, or simply mad. No treatment existed beyond restraint if the person was dangerous. Most mentally ill people were simply abandoned to fate. Pain management was primitive. Opium existed and was used, but it was expensive and not widely available. Most people simply endured pain. Chronic pain, acute pain from injury or illness. You suffered through it because there was no alternative. Life expectancy was short by modern standards. Making it to 50 was doing well. Many died, much younger. Disease, accidents, childbirth, epidemics, violence, all took their toll. You'd likely see many contemporaries die before you. This shaped attitudes. Death was familiar. People grieved but also accepted mortality. Funerals happened regularly. Tombs lined the roads outside the city. Death was present, visible, unavoidable. When someone died, the body needed to be dealt with quickly, especially in warm weather. Funerals happened soon after death. For the poor, burials were simple. The body wrapped and placed in the ground or in a columbarium, a communal burial structure. For the slightly better off, there might be a memorial stone or more elaborate burial. Mourning was ritualized but brief. Life had to continue. Work could stop for extended grief. You mourn, you bury your dead, you continue living. This constant presence of illness and death meant Romans were arguably more accepting of mortality than modern people. Life was precarious, death was common, and you lived with this reality every day. If you survived the many dangers of Roman life long enough to become elderly, what did that look like? First, understand that elderly came earlier than in modern times. A 50-year, old Roman was old. A 60-year, old was very old. Making it to 70 was remarkable. Bodies wore out faster due to hard labor, poor nutrition, and lack of medical care. Physical decline would be obvious. Joints would ache constantly, vision would fail, hearing would deteriorate. Teeth would be gone or going, strength would diminish. Tasks that were easy at 30 would be difficult or impossible at 50. If you could no longer work, you faced serious problems. Economic survival depended on working. If you could work, you depended on family to support you, or you faced poverty and begging. For some fortunate elderly, family support was available. If you had adult children who were doing reasonably well, they might support you in your declining years. You live with them, help with what you could manage, watching grandchildren, doing light household tasks, and they provide food and shelter. This wasn't certain though. If your children were struggling themselves, they might not be able to support you. If you had poor relations with family, they might abandon you. If you had no family, you had no support. Some elderly ended up begging, unable to work, lacking family support. They sit in public places asking for charity. Some Romans gave to elderly beggars out of respect or pity. Many walked past. It was a precarious, undignified existence. Physical labor became impossible. Even if you'd been a craftsman, your hands would eventually become too weak or painful to work. If you'd been a laborer, your back and legs would give out. There was no transitioning to lighter work. You either could work or you couldn't. Respect for the elderly existed in theory. Roman culture valued the wisdom of elders, at least rhetorically. But in practice, the elderly who could contribute economically were often seen as burdens. Cognitive decline happened then as now. Some elderly Romans remained sharp until death. Others experienced what we now recognize as dementia. For those with declining mental faculties, life became confusing and frightening. Family might care for them or might not. There were no facilities for elder care. Physical pain would be constant for most elderly. Arthritis, old injuries, deteriorating bodies. You simply live with pain because there was nothing else to do. Opium was too expensive, you endured. Mobility declined. Stairs became difficult or impossible. Walking distances became shorter. Eventually, you might be confined to your home or your room. Leaving the house became a major undertaking or stopped happening altogether. Social life narrowed. Friends would die. Family might be busy with their own lives. You spend more time alone, or with whoever was immediately present. The bustling street life that occupied younger years would become inaccessible. For elderly women who had been supported by husbands, widowhood brought new challenges. A widow without adult children to support her might be desperate. Some remarried for economic survival. Some struggled alone. Some became beggars. Elderly men without wives faced similar challenges. Who would prepare food? Who would maintain the household? Without family support, basic survival became difficult. Some elderly found dignity in final years. If they'd been successful earlier, they might have some savings or property providing income. If they had respectful, supportive families, they could live out their years cared for. These were the fortunate ones. For many, though, old age was difficult and undignified. Physical decline, economic precarity, loss of independence, constant pain, social isolation. You'd survive as long as you could and then you'd die. Death would likely come from illness, injury, or simply the body giving out. Medical care for the elderly was no better than for anyone else. When serious illness came, survival was unlikely. The elderly were buried like anyone else. If they had family, the funeral would be attended. If they'd been alone and poor, burial might be perfunctory. Either way, life continued for those left behind. Growing old in Rome wasn't something to look forward to. You accepted it because aging was inevitable. But there was no romanticizing the golden years. Old age meant decline, dependency, and approaching death. You hoped for family support and relatively quick end. That was the best you could expect. Let's talk about all the things that defined Rome in popular imagination, but that most ordinary Romans never experienced. Gladiatorial games, as mentioned, were rare. Most Romans might see them a handful of times in their entire lives. They were expensive to stage, held for special occasions, and attending meant taking time from work and possibly paying entrance fees. The image of Romans constantly watching gladiators is false. The Colosseum itself, most Romans never entered it. If you lived in Rome when it existed, you'd see it. It was massive and prominent. But actually attending events there wasn't a regular occurrence for ordinary people. It was for special occasions, and even then, might not be accessible to you. Fancy dining, with multiple courses and exotic foods, was for the wealthy. Ordinary Romans ate pulse and bread, occasional vegetables, rarely meat. Elaborate feasts happened in the homes of the rich, not in insular apartments. You heard about these meals but never experienced them. Literacy wasn't universal. Many Romans couldn't read or write. If you were literate, it was likely basic, enough to conduct simple business, read public notices, perhaps write basic messages. Reading literature or philosophy was for the educated elite, not ordinary people. Travel beyond the immediate area was rare. Most Romans stayed in their city or region their entire lives. The roads, the provinces, the diversity of the empire, these were things you heard about, not things you experienced. Rome was your world, and beyond Rome might as well have been myth. Political participation was limited. Yes, technically citizens had rights, but in practice political power rested with the elite. Ordinary people might vote when elections happened, but their individual influence was minimal. Politics was something done to you, not something you meaningfully participated in. Art and culture, in the sense of theatre, philosophy, literature, these existed but weren't accessible to everyone. Theatre required payment. Philosophy was discussed by educated people, not labourers. Literature was for those who could read and afford books. Most Romans had no engagement with high culture. Military service happened for some, but not all. If you served in the legions, that was a major life experience. But many Romans never served. If you weren't recruited or didn't volunteer, military life was something others did. Your experience of Rome's military might was hearing about campaigns, not fighting in them. Temples, especially large, impressive ones, existed, but daily life didn't involve visiting them constantly. You might go occasionally for specific purposes, but the grand religious structures were more symbols of power than places you personally frequented. The aqueducts brought water to Rome, an engineering marvel, but you experienced this as water available at fountains, not as the impressive structure itself. The mechanics of Rome's water supply were invisible to you, present only in the results. Imperial presence was distant. The emperor was abstract, someone who ruled but wasn't visible in your daily life unless he made a public appearance. Even then, you'd be one of thousands watching from a distance. The emperor affected your life through laws and policies, but as a person, he was remote. Senate proceedings, political intrigues, the workings of government, these happened but not in your world. You heard results, new laws, new taxes, announcements, but the processes that created them were opaque, Government was something that existed above you, mysterious and inaccessible. Wealthy homes with gardens, fountains, frescoes, mosaics. You'd never enter such places. You might walk past them on the street, seeing walls and locked doors. The life inside was completely different from yours, but you'd never experience it. Slavery was everywhere in Rome, but your relationship to it varied. You might have owned a slave if you were slightly better off, or you might have been barely above slave status yourself. The large households with dozens of slaves were not your experience. Your relationship to slavery was immediate and small-scale or non-existent. Libraries existed in some public places, but accessing them required literacy and time. If you were working all day just to survive, you weren't spending afternoons in libraries. These were for people with leisure and education. The forum was a grand public space, and you might walk through it, but the business conducted there, important legal cases, significant political speeches, major commercial deals. This wasn't your business. You were just passing through a space where important things happened to other people. All of these things defined Rome in important ways, but they defined Rome from a distance for you. You were aware they existed. You might occasionally glimpse them, but they weren't your daily experience. Your Rome was insulae, tabernae, public latrines, baths, streets, and constant work. That was the Rome you lived in, not the Rome of marble buildings and grand spectacles. So what have we learned about daily life in ancient Rome for ordinary people? We've learned it was mundane, repetitive, focused on basic survival, getting food, shelter, work, managing in crowded conditions, dealing with discomfort, illness, uncertainty, day after day with little variation or excitement. This isn't the Rome of Hollywood movies or dramatic histories. This is the Rome that actually existed for the majority of people who lived there. Not exciting, not glamorous, just ordinary. The poles you ate for every meal, the small apartment you shared with your family, the shop where you worked long hours for minimal income, the public latrine with no privacy, the streets full of noise and crowds and smells, the constant low-level struggle to make it through another day, another week, another year. This was normal life. This was what being Roman actually meant for most Romans. You weren't attending gladiatorial games or dining at feasts or participating in political intrigues. You were working, eating porridge, using public toilets, bathing occasionally, sleeping in cramped conditions, and repeating this cycle endlessly. And yet, Romans did this. Millions of them, across centuries. They got up every day and lived these mundane lives. They found meaning in family and work, in small pleasures. They endured discomfort and uncertainty and kept going. There is something both depressing and inspiring about this. Depressing because it shows how hard life was, how much suffering was simply normal and accepted. Inspiring because it shows human resilience, the ability to continue living, and even finding some satisfaction in difficult circumstances. The ordinary Roman didn't expect luxury or excitement. They expected to work, to eat simple food, to manage somehow. And most of them did manage. They survived, raised families, participated in their communities. They were the foundation of Roman civilization, even though history largely ignores them. When we look at Roman ruins today, we see temples and forums and aqueducts. We don't see the insulae where people actually lived. Those are gone, unpreserved, unimportant to later generations. The grand structures survived because they were stone. The ordinary structures were temporary, expendable, forgotten. But those ordinary structures house the real life of Rome. The daily struggles, the small joys, the constant work, the relationships, the meals, the sleep, the waking to do it all again. That was Rome, more than any marble building. And that ordinary Roman life isn't so different from ordinary life in any era. Really, most people, most of the time throughout history, have lived mundane lives focused on basic needs. The specifics change, the technology, the social structures, the physical environment. But the fundamental experience of ordinary daily life, of getting through each day and finding small satisfactions where possible, that is universal. Tonight, we've spent time understanding this ordinary Roman life, not because it is exciting, but because it is real, because millions of real people lived this way. Because understanding ordinary life helps us understand history more honestly than focusing only on dramatic events and famous people. Those ordinary Romans got up in the morning in their crowded apartments. They ate their porridge. They went to work in their shops. They used public toilets. They bathed with crowds of strangers. They came home tired. They ate more porridge. They slept. And the next day they did it again. Day after day, year after year, generation after generation. Ordinary people living ordinary lives in ancient Rome. And perhaps that is enough. To have lived, to have endured, to have been part of this vast human story, even in small and unremarkable ways. The ordinary Romans didn't need to be extraordinary. They just needed to be, and they were. So rest well tonight, and maybe appreciate that your life, however ordinary it might seem, is probably more comfortable than what ordinary Romans experienced. You have privacy, plumbing, varied food, countless conveniences they couldn't imagine. But also remember that they managed without these things. They lived full lives in conditions we'd find intolerable. They were human, just like us, making do with what they had. Good night, everyone. Sleep well in your private rooms with your comfortable beds, and maybe spare a thought for those ancient Romans, sleeping in their crowded insulae, facing another day of porridge and public latrines and hard work. They lived, they endured, and in their own way, they mattered.